Welcome back. My guest in this segment, as he is every Tuesday, Dan McDermitt, Charting Man Dan with thechartguys.com. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, James. Glad to be here.
So Dan, let's talk a bit about what's moving the markets around today from a technical perspective. Certainly there's been nothing but weakness in the cannabis sector generally, but that's a reflection, I think, of markets, the broad market globally. Is that what you would sort of see from where you sit?
Definitely. It's always the S&P 500 recently that we are watching as step number one to get a gauge of what the market is doing, and it's still weak. Every little bounce is just a lower high. We still have uncertainty with Trump and China. And again, it's always a joke where, you know, you have the Canadian sector as its own little universe, but the Canadians that in our chat room sort of unfortunately now have to pay attention to Trump and, you know, all of these tweets that he's sending out. So the bottom line is, yes, we are still weak in the S&P 500, and yes, that is still causing weakness in the MJ sector.
Okay, so what's going to catalyze a reversal, and do you see that happening anytime soon?
Well, fundamentally, what would be a great start would be an inked deal between China and the U.S. and get rid of all this market uncertainty. The market certainly is not enjoying that uncertainty. That would be a fundamental reason. As far as technically speaking, we just need a change in the trend on the daily time frame, which is marked by higher lows and higher highs, and we're just not anywhere near seeing that at this point. So patiently waiting for daily trend changes to show a shift in momentum from weakness to a little bit of a bounce.
Right. Okay. And so it was interesting to me that the macro catalyst of Cronos Group receiving the investment from Altria and the over $2 billion investment didn't really catalyze a sector-wide lift like the $5 billion investment by Constellation did into Canopy. Why is that?
Well, what the market does is it's really smart and it prices things in. So the reason that Canopy was such a big deal is it was the first one in the sector. So that's everybody saying, oh, wow, this is legit. We're going to see real companies come in now. And so then everybody raises up. All the tides raise all ships. So now we had Cronos, and it's a little bit of a lesser reaction. And yet again, everybody gets raised up. So Aurora, who doesn't have a deal yet, they saw a 7% response that day. So that's the market pricing in that Aurora is eventually going to get a deal. So I anticipate that the next deal that we get from a major company, if it's in line with what we've seen in the past, it's going to get even less of a reaction because the market has been pricing in that these deals are coming now for the last month plus and however long that we've been getting them. So I think it's just a little bit of a lesser effect each time we get this news.
Okay, so technically heading towards the end of the year, are we in store? What's in store for cannabis investors? More continued weakness going into the new year, or do you think there would be some kind of a reversal to the upside?
I'm keeping an eye out for a short-term bounce, which would last maybe a week or two. It wouldn't change the long-term weekly trend. It would just set a lower high on the weekly time frame, and I'll point that out here in just a moment. But other than that, it's not looking like we're just going to see. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of disheartened people out there. And again, like you said, the fact that this Cronos deal was not a catalyst, and that's going to further dishearten people. So we have to go through the emotional cycles and the market cycles, and it's going to reach a point where everybody's bummed and everybody's bored and things are slow. And that's when we'll start to shift that psychology and momentum in the other direction. Okay,
before we get to the charts, any macro catalysts out there on the horizon that you see that might be a sector-wide raising of all boats?
Aside from federal changes in the U.S. that would obviously impact the U.S. sector the most, but Canadian sector would definitely get an impact as well. That is the golden goose egg of what the market could be looking for right now would be federal U.S. changes in laws.
Sure. Okay, and why don't you walk us through the chart now?
So here what I'm looking at is CGC on the weekly time frame. And what I was talking about, the possibility to see a couple week bounce, CGC can get anywhere all the way up until 46.74 and still just form a lower high. So we're not going to change any kind of trend. We could see a 20% bounce and still just form a lower high. So there is a possibility heading into the new year for a short-term bounce. But again, without any kind of significant catalyst, it's going to take a long time for these trends to shift. And what we're essentially going to have to see is a move up, set that lower high, pull back for a higher low, and then the higher high would change the trend. So that's going to take weeks and weeks to play out without some quick catalyst to do the work for the bulls. So what I want to talk about now is what I look at when I'm comparing individual names to know who's stronger in the sector and who's weaker. And we just had the recent news event with Aphria with the whole short scandal, and that is a date that is important to me, December 3rd, because that's the date where the vast majority of individual names saw weakness, and we pulled back very hard from that. So what I want to know is who is still below the December 3rd high and who has fully recovered and is above that level right now. And we can see that CGC is nowhere near breaking its December high, so it's a bit weaker than everybody else. And when I go through and compare to other individual names, here's Aurora, and I see the December 3rd high of 787 on the Canadian side of things. And here we are breaking that level today. So we've made a V-shaped recovery. We've taken back that weakness that we saw in correlation to that Aphria short piece, and that's a recovery. And what I'm also noticing is that the vast majority of US names are seeing that recovery as well. Here's NBEV, NBEV. We have an uptrend here. This is a month-long uptrend of daily higher lows and higher highs. And we don't have many names in the sector that have such a clear uptrend, and certainly not on the Canadian side of things. But NBEV is showing a lot of strength. We've got CWEB with a V-shaped recovery back over the high of December 3rd. We've got IAN also over the high of December 3rd with a V-shaped recovery. And KSHB is another one that has an uptrend and is topping out a little bit of resistance. But the bottom line is seeing an uptrend, again, stands out in such a weak sector right now. So I'm comparing individual names to where we stood the day the bad news came for Aphria. And here's Aphria right now. Here's that gap down day on December 3rd. And Aphria is still trying to make its own recovery. But the bottom line is I'm seeing more strength in the US side of things than the Canadian side of things. That can be potentially attributed to the Farm Bill. And what's interesting about the Farm Bill in the US is it's not this kind of singular news event. Like, we get a news release that there's a deal with CRON and that's set in stone. Whereas this is sort of, kicking the can down the road a little bit. We get word that there's an agreement reached, and then we get someone signing the bill, and then it has to eventually go on the desk of the president to sign. So we price it in piece by piece rather than all at once with a big gap up open. But I do believe that that's the short-term catalyst that is pushing the USMJ names a little bit stronger than the Canadian names.
So what exactly is the nature of that catalytic force in the Farm Bill? What is it going to do for the valuation of U.S. operators?
Well, it's going to open it up federally to be legal for industrial hemp in the United States, which hasn't happened in, 90 years since it's been made illegal. And that's essentially just going to open the door for expansion. The next major catalyst that I'm looking for is for marijuana to be removed from Schedule 1, because that's going to open the door for the banks to get involved. And then we're going to be able to see, significant funding in these companies to allow for that expansion of operations. So there are certainly companies that are operating with their industrial hemp in individual states that have already legalized. This just opens the gates in terms of expansion and where your target market can be spread around the country, or where your operations are spread around the country. So it's not, the holy grail, but it is definitely a step. And it's also going to incite the confidence in the U.S. investor that, okay, we're actually are getting, government changes. Government can certainly be slow and long and drawn out, but changes are happening. And that's going to make us see people get excited for descheduling and get excited for potentially seeing some further longer major changes in the marijuana space in the United States.
Sure. Do you think there's a risk that the federal deprohibition or ratification of CBD legislation is going to catalyze a supply-side surplus resulting in price competition?
Oh, I'm sure it is. Right now, CBD is definitely very expensive, and I do expect prices to drop as supply does increase, and we'll reach an equilibrium of prices eventually. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. The same way that we will with cannabis, prices are going to drop as people get better at producing it, and their prices drop as well. So is something to be aware of longer term, absolutely. And that's where a lot of people feel that the MJ companies that have value added products are the ones that are going to be surviving, not the ones that are, you know, potentially just growing the bud, but the ones that are turning it into edibles or turning it into concentrates and all these other products. That's where a lot of people see the potential profit margins.
Okay, so coming back to your observations about the companies that have fully recovered versus those that are still trying to stage recovery, do you think that like Charlotte's Web, for example, has staged a full recovery so that it's recovered all of its lost ground? And you say that that might be in part driven by the Farm Bill. Do you think that as we inch closer to the Farm Bill, that these U.S. names will continue to outperform that have big exposure to CBD products?
I do believe that that is a potential short-term catalyst to continue outpacing Canadian MJ names to a certain degree, but it also gets to the point where it gets priced in. So we know that the Farm Bill is most likely going to get signed, and the market is really good at reacting to what's most likely to happen. So when it actually does happen and we're actually finally seeing it signed by the president and it's the real deal, I don't expect any kind of significant bullish reaction because each step of the way it's been priced into the market.
Right. Okay, Dan. Well, fascinating as usual. Really appreciate your input, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, James. Have a good one.